Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are watching this. Thank you for joining me for the second part of our lecture on the modern civil rights movement. So, in the last lecture, I focused on the evolution of the civil rights movement. You have the start of the legal battles, then you have the fights at the grassroots to test whether or not, states and local officials were actually going to enforce um, the, enforce the decisions that were behind Brown versus Board, saying that segregation in public facilities is illegal. So you saw people, whether it is the Montgomery bus boycott, whether it is Little Rock Nine, whether it is the Freedom Riders or the North Carolina, the Greensboro Four. These are individuals who were testing whether or not this decision by the Supreme Court, if enacted, what would it require? And what it required was people actually getting involved. And so, what you see moving from that period of actual grassroots, you see to more national, you see the March on Washington, you see the Birmingham campaign, you see the March to Selma, and eventually culminating in the legal achievements of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, while Dr. King and others who were often associated with this movement, there were other people who had a differing philosophy on the approach of civil rights. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that. We're going to look at, in particular, Malcolm X and the influences, the leaders, the thoughts, the philosophies that influenced his approach to civil rights during the 1960s. And we're going to look at that as a way of comparing, because I never want you to think that there's only one way that people go about trying to assert their rights. Right, there are a multitude of frameworks, but Malcolm X certainly is covered historically. If you're fortunate enough to have learned anything about his work or his writings or his evolution as a civil rights leader, you will have discovered that this was a man who understood, the everyday realities. That he was a product of the environment in which he was in. And it is not that, just to, I will reiterate this again, it is not that he was against the approach of Dr. King. He saw, Dr. King's approach as one approach that you could take, one of many. He just felt that his approach was far more in line with where he felt that many of those people who were uh, causing Black people to have to assert their freedom and their rights and to justify their humanity, that his approach in terms of this self-sufficiency, independency, self protection, self-defense was necessary. And so we will take a look at that. And I think that it's a good thing to be able to understand, where those philosophies differ. And we'll look at that in terms of the quotes that really come to encapsulate, the philosophies of both of these leaders. Okay, so what we'll be looking at is the philosophies, the alternative philosophies to direct and nonviolent action. We're going to be looking at how the tactics basically begin to shift in 1965, 1966, in terms of how other groups were starting to assert civil rights and being able to try to think about what exactly they needed to do to be able to assert their freedom. And we'll also be looking at the other, groups that came about during this period, whether that's the Chicano movement, the American Indian or Native American, and then, of course, second wave feminism. Okay, so let's start with Malcolm X. Malcolm X, pivotal figure. I don't think that there is anything to um, to quibble about his impact and what exactly and how exactly he went about that. What I think historically is that when people often compare the two individuals, Malcolm X and Dr. King, they try to compare them, or they're often presented, excuse me, they're often presented as opposites, and they're not opposites. These are individuals who are presenting approaches based off of the situations to which they see daily. And Malcolm X is, an individual who shared the same, approach, the same ideologies as Dr. King in terms of the eradication of racism and white supremacy. But he was far more influenced by the ideologies of black consciousness as well as black nationalism. And these are ideas that are definitely coming about in the 1960s as a consequence of the decolonization movements that were happening in the 50s and 60s in Africa as well as across the world. And so his approach, Malcolm X, was one that was heavily critical of Dr. King in terms of, this idea of integration, this idea that, we have to be, an individual that demonstrates our humanity, in order to be able to get the other, mainly white people, to understand and to see the errors of their ways so that they will once again allow and want to be integrated with us. Malcolm X felt that, that approach really hinged on this idea that first, there was a desire on the white community to actually want to be integrated, and two, that if white people were so interested in this idea of integration or equality or opportunities for black people, then why exactly do every single opportunity that they have in which to resist that? Whether that is to, ignore the laws, the rules of the rulings of the Supreme Court, or if that's an opportunity to boycott or to, to riot, or, just simply to attack and demean black people every chance that they get. If white people are so interested, as Malcolm X would have critiqued Dr. King on this, then why exactly do they seem so resistant to this idea? And he wasn't exactly sold on this idea that black people should just lay down and take beatings and get crushed, for this idea that eventually white people will see the error of their ways. He was far more interested in an idea that embodied self-defense, self-determination, economic empowerment, and of course self-love. And one of the things that I think is often associated, many of you have probably heard this, is this idea of, that his position on separatism. Well, separatism, or his by any means necessary, that he's often associated with, it's because of where and how Malcolm X, grew up. What was the world that he saw daily? He sees the exploitation and the beatings that happen, as a consequence of being black in America by white power authorities, whether that's the police, whether that's the local government, right? He sees the inequalities in terms of employment, in terms of education. And, this idea that, he was not sold on this idea that white people actually wanted black people to have, dignity. He didn't believe that. If that was the case, as he would push, against, Martin Luther King, Dr. King's philosophy, is that if that was the case, then why do we need to march? What's the point? Why do we need to have, these massive movements in order to demonstrate our humanity if our humanity are actually already is? And so Malcolm X, is his approach is one that embodies rather an ideology of not asking for white people to recognize black people's humanity, is that Malcolm X was pushing that notion of black consciousness, that black people need to recognize their own humanity, that they don't need the recognition of an other to discover themselves. right? That they don't need the permission, that they don't need this sense of like you're good enough. They already are good enough. Black people already are good. But the reason why this belief that there needs to be somehow you know, a recognition by white people that gives black people credit or a sense of uh, of uh, of personhood, right? That can only be recognized by the group in power. Malcolm X was very much against that. He was like, no, we don't need the other to be able to tell us who we are. We can determine and to tell ourselves who we are because we know who we are. But it is only a consequence of white supremacy and racism and bigotry and oppression that has, polluted and prevented ourselves from recognizing how magnificent we are as Black people, right? That is what Black consciousness is, right? It is not, when we think of by any means necessary, many people automatically go to this idea of violence, especially white people during this period, is that, oh, what he's clearly advocating for is race war. That's not what he's talking about. Is that Malcolm X, if you read his work and you read, his writings, and if you listen to his speeches, what he's advocating for is a total conscientious movement that by any means necessary is to take every aspect of one's life and to analyze it and to celebrate the significance, the achievements, the beauty, the love, the passion, the talent that existed. And that is very different than, than the perspectives that white people were putting out there. And so, take a look. Take a look at some of the, the ideas that he pushed. This is a wonderful article that you can look at. It actually is from the radio show Fresh Air, with Terry Gross. And this was back in 2020, but it's based on a book called The Sword and the Shield, which is a wonderful way, I think, of illustrating the roles in that both Dr. King and Malcolm X played in the civil rights movement. But please, definitely take a look. Okay. So let's go on to the next. So when we're thinking about their philosophies, and I'm going to try to move my little video over here so it's not in the way. I want you to take a look at some of their speeches that they've given. And it's that if you read, Dr. King and Malcolm X, you can see that yes, they're very much on the same page in terms of ending uh inequality, white supremacy, segregation, right? They don't want that, right? They don't want this the conditions that Black people are going through. But there's a very big difference in terms of their philosophies. So if we take like violence, for instance. So if you read Martin Luther King, he says, it is dangerous to organize a movement around self-defense. The line separating defensive violence and aggressive violence is very thin. The minute a program of violence is enunciated, even for self-defense, the atmosphere is filled with talk of violence, and the words falling on many ears may be interpreted as an invitation to aggression. Well, that's one way of looking at it. So Dr. King's approach is that, well, if you assert this idea of self-defense, you're automatically calling for violence. If you do that, then that automatically creates a reaction. Well, let's see what Malcolm X says. Since self-preservation is the first law of nature, we assert the Afro-American right of self-defense. The Constitution of the USA clearly affirms the right of every American citizen to bear arms. And as Americans, we will not give up a single right guaranteed under the Constitution. The history of unpublished violence against our people clearly indicates that we must be prepared to defend ourselves, or we will continue to be a defenseless people at the mercy of a ruthless and violent racist mob. So, if you remember the approaches that happened after World War One, right? Or actually, let's go back to after the Civil War during Reconstruction. Remember all of the race riots that were happening? to black communities. Remember the lynchings, remember the violence. Then fast forward to World War I, when you had black soldiers returning, and during the Red Summer, they decided to take up self-defense positions to protect their neighborhoods. Right. This was something that was advocated by W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the, leading thinkers in the black community at the time. And so when we look at this, like, think of how Malcolm X is really presenting this idea that, well, there's actually a fundamental issue going on here, right? If we don't recognize the fact that there has been a history of violence in this country towards African Americans, it hasn't been a history of peace, it hasn't been a history of integration, it hasn't been a history of equality, it's been a history of oppression. And so this idea that, he's not advocating, it doesn't say that he's advocating violence. He's advocating that they need to protect themselves, right? That they shouldn't just wait for somebody to come in and burn their homes, or kill their families, burn their crops. Like, this is what he's arguing for. He didn't say that he's advocating violence. What he's saying is he Malcolm X is recognizing that we recognize the situations that we're in. This is the situation. This is the history of our country. This has been the history of how our people have been affected, right? To be able to just ignore that and negate that, and to say, like, well, guess what? Hey, if we demonstrate our humanity to these individuals, we can fundamentally change them. Well, Malcolm X is coming at a point of, of looking at it from Dr. King's perspective. Dr. King is saying that, well, if individuals, go through these periods of violence and their enemy recognizes eventually the other's own humanity, they will stop. Okay, well, Malcolm X would say, like, well, why not assert my own humanity by defending myself? That's another way for somebody to be able to recognize how human I am, because I am able to assert and defend and protect myself just as they are. Right? This isn't a necessarily, one of the key aspects to this is that if any of you read Frantz Fanon, who is also an individual who, is a part of the Black consciousness movement, but he is writing his texts as a consequence of the decolonization movements that were happening in Africa at the time, particularly Algeria. He writes that violence, that he advocates for violence, but violence that is targeted, violence that is meant to respond, not violence that is meant to provoke. Right? It is not uncontrolled, random violence. It is targeted, it is specific, it is directed, right? And so what Malcolm X is pointing out here is that he is not directing violence, he's directing people to protect themselves from a history of violence should that happen. If it clearly reads here, if you look at this, that he's not saying that we need to go out and find the people. He's just saying when they come, be prepared. Now, if they never come, there we go. Everybody's happy. Everybody's fine. But what I find so fascinating about these narratives is that, if a bunch of white people are, actively deciding to, tar and feather a bunch of agents of the king because they don't like the price of tea, or they don't like the fact of taxes, it's asserting their rights. But as soon as black people decide to, create a defensive position to protect their families and their homes, they're suddenly promoting violence. And that is also caught up in the white supremacy, ideals and perspectives of our country, right? Even the very framing, Malcolm X would point out that that is what we have to consciously aware, how that framing, how that narrative is directed at black people in a negative way, right? Okay, so let's take a look at some more. You've got aspects in terms of the role of white people in the civil rights movement. And it's interesting because we know that Malcolm X's ideas certainly evolved over time, right? At first, he is very much in the position that the solution, the way that these problems will be solved, they will be solved by black people, right? he wasn't interested, and you can see it right there. It's like, brothers, as he says, the white man can't give you the solution. You will never get the solution from any white liberal. Don't let them come in and tell you what we should do to solve the problem. Those days are over. They can't do it, and they won't do it. As to King, another group with a vital role to play in the present crisis is the Northern white liberals. The racial issue which we confront in America is not a sectional but a national problem. The citizenship rights of Negroes cannot be flouted anywhere without impairing the rights of every American. Okay. Still, you can see that Dr. King is advocating this aspect of humanity, but I think what's interesting from reading both King and X is that both recognize that the idea that change would come, it certainly isn't going to necessarily come from white people suddenly realizing that they did something wrong or that they've been wrong or that they need to change, right? Remember, change comes as a consequence of a Supreme Court case, a law, right? Something like that. It's never the majority that decides. It is a minority that's going to decide that's going to fundamentally change this. And so, this is one of those aspects that when you're thinking about it, really question yourself when you read the differences between Malcolm and, Malcolm X and Dr. King, it's that think about where their philosophies are rooted, what exactly their experience was, and it was at the time, and how that influenced and shaped their ideologies in terms of what ultimately they wanted to achieve. The idea of, equality and self-defense, they share a horizon. The ultimate horizon is self-determination, to the ability to be able to choose for oneself. But it to be able, if we study this and look at this in a way that looks for more dissimilarities or separate ideologies that are somehow not along the same plane, then what we do is we lose the richness of how people were ultimately trying to figure out how to improve themselves based off the situations in which they were facing, right? Civil rights, the struggle for improvement, the struggle for change is local, right? It's local. There are national implications of what happens around here in this country. But we should understand that what happens to our brothers and sisters in one state, in one city, can be an example for what we may have to face or what we already have faced or how we have done that, right? We need to look at both X and King as ideologies that can enhance our approach to addressing a complicated and multivariated set of problems when it comes to these ideas. Now, when we think about as civil rights begins to progress, one of the biggest issues that happens, and I'm sorry, I did not find I'm gonna find the video for y'all. But one of the things that changes in 1966 is that there is a speech given by Stokely Carmichael, who was one of the founding members of excuse me, not one of the founding members, one of the civil rights leaders in the student movement, especially in the areas of, Mississippi, Alabama, and in the South. And Stokely Carmichael, like many people at the time, had at first, bought into, the approaches of Dr. King. However, as the Voting Rights Act, passes in 65, Civil Rights Act in 64, people in 66 are starting to get a little bit disenchanted with the progress that they see. And because there are far more ideologies that are being put out there, more and more people are starting to question whether or not there needed to be other tactics. And this is where Malcolm X, who actually gets assassinated in 1965, his ideologies, as well as those of Black power and Black consciousness and Black nationalism, start to take hold. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael makes a speech, and his speech says that we need to have Black power. what he was talking about, and I'll put up the link for y'all, because what he was talking about in this moment is that he was questioning and asking whether or not this this approach to integrationist humanitarian aspect of peace, nonviolence is really an effective way to get what we want. And so this idea that Black Power, the Black Power ideology, is this idea of self-determination, Black consciousness, you know, self-sufficiency, self-defense, right? What we need when he says Black Power is he's talking about we first need to recognize ourselves as being those who are in charge of our own destiny, right? This is very much in the lines of, of Malcolm X. And so one organization that I'm sure many of you are familiar with to some degree is the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panther Party was founded in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. I'm actually originally from Oakland, California. I was born and raised on 55th and Brookdale in East Oakland. Where they founded it at Merritt College was actually one of the colleges I actually taught at when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. Merritt College. It's in the hills of Oakland, but Huey went to Oakland Tech, which is a high school on Broadway. It's near downtown Oakland, and it's a huge school. It's got maybe if you guys have seen the movie what is it with Will Smith and Whoopi Goldberg, the one about it's called Made in America, I believe it is. It's like you'll actually see it. There's a scene where they show the front of the school. But anyways, take a look. But the point is that remember how, if you take the ideologies of, King and X, what people started to do was to wrangle with all of the experiences that they had seen in the 60s and the late 50s and the 60s, and they begin to try to understand, well, what exactly seem to be the problems that are going on here in our area. And one of the biggest problems that was going on in Oakland at the time was police brutality. I mean, it was not uncommon for, police officers just to get out of their car and just, push somebody, beat them up, shoot them, right? It wasn't uncommon. There was a constant aggression. And the Black Panther Party was an organization that began to really put into place their ideology as influenced through Black consciousness and Black nationalism into actual fundamental programs. Their ideology was a blend of Black nationalism and Marxist-Leninist teachings, Pan-African thought, certainly, because in 1966, you've already had, several, former colonies in Africa assert their independence. And so, what we're looking at here is that we're looking at a group that is influenced by the movements of the time, the changes that are happening, and a willingness to try to see how all of these different approaches and all of these different movements that are happening, what type of changes can they make in their own local community. And so they had a 10-point program. And if you take a look at it, it discusses precisely what they want. Freedom. We want the power to determine the destiny of our Black community, right? They want full employment. They want housing. They want education. They want, they want, immediate end to the police brutality, right? These are all of these examples of the things that they want. And this 10-point program was produced not just on pamphlets, but it was put in the newspaper that the Black Panther Party ran. It was a constant refrain every single time they were in front of the media. But what is most important to recognize about this, it's not just the provocativeness of this idea of self-defense when they go up to the state capitol in Sacramento and they're carrying guns into the state legislature, and the governor at the time, who was Ronald Reagan, is just like, this is absolutely crazy. Because you can take a look at some of the aspects. But let me just back this up so you can see one of the rallies. This was actually in Oakland in 1968, and I'm going to show you one of the individuals who's speaking here. So
of oppression, we must deal with them.
Listen to
that
this.
Right here in the confines of racist America, racism must be stopped. Lyndon Johnson, he can always raise an argument.
So this individual right here, his name is H. Rat Brown. And so just listen to what he's talking about, and you can hear the ideas of Black consciousness and Black nationalism in what he's saying.
About law and order because he never talks about justice. But black people fall for that same argument and they go around talking about lawbreakers. We did not make the laws in this country. We are neither morally nor legally confined to those laws. Those laws that keep them up keep us down. You got to begin to understand that. For 400 years, she taught you white nationalism and you lapped it up. You taught it to your children. You had your children thinking that everything black was bad. Cows don't give good milk. Black hens don't lay eggs. Black for funerals, white for weddings. That's white nationalism. Santa Claus. A white honky who slides down a black chimney and comes out what? We can equate progress with concessions. We can no longer make that mistake. You see, when they gave us that nigger astronaut, you said we were making progress, but I told you they were going to lose him in space. He didn't get that far. You put that you think they're going to do it Thursday Marshall when they get tired of him. They gave you Walker Washington of Washington, D.C., and you said we were making progress. That's not progress. See, it's no in between. You're either free or you're a slave. There's no such thing as second-class citizenship.
Okay. So when you hear this ideology, what you can hear in H. Rat Brown, as well as in other leaders of the time, what you can hear is that consciousness, right? That what they see over the course up until the late 1960s is that, well, what have we received? What have we gotten? What is better? How are we improving, right? His argument that, well, you can't equate progress with concessions, right? That's not progress. You're either making progress or you're not. You're either free or you're a slave. It's one or the other, right? That idea that he is pushing for is a critique of where the civil rights movement was. And it was a critique that many people who were participating in it were questioning. They were like, well, where exactly is this going? Now, remember, in 1968, Dr. King is going to be assassinated. And so, this is what's going to even further this ideology that was like, look at what happens, right? Look as a consequence of this, right? That even an individual who is so interested in integration and equality and meeting you at the table of brotherhood, you have him killed, right? You have him assassinated. And this is one of the things that is most critical to understand about the civil rights movement is that as it begins to morph and change, people are trying to understand, like, well, what have we achieved in this time? And one of the most difficult things about looking at civil rights is you ask yourself, it's like, how exactly do you measure true freedom, right? Is true freedom just in those aspects of tangibles, such as the ability to vote, the ability to choose for oneself where one lives or works or whom they love, right? Is that the tangible, the physical access to it? Or is it actually something conscious? Is it something in your consciousness that actually determines your freedom? And this is something that, individuals, especially in the late 1960s and the 70s, were asking themselves, is that what these movements begin to ask is, am I truly free in my mind? H. Rat Brown brings up that idea that there's been this ideology that has been infiltrated, that has conditioned Black people to see themselves, to see Black as something bad, right? And so he's opening up this ideology to other groups as well, that how to have they been conditioned, how to has white supremacy as an ideology infiltrated every aspect of our life, from our legal system, our economic system, our political system, to our very conscientiousness, in terms of how we see ourselves, right? And so what he's doing is he's asking and trying to question and push back against that, right? That maybe we need to start there. And it was very interesting. I had a conversation with one of my friends. Um, this was many years ago, African American man. And, you know, there was a question that we were discussing, us being, educators and, talking about philosophy and stuff. And, he said something to me that has still stuck with me after all these years, is that he said, Nick, I really wish I understood what it meant to be free. And what he was talking about wasn't the fact that he can't vote. It's not the fact that, this is a man who is, educated, he has degrees, he has money, he has resources, right? But he's still not free. And what is he not free from? He's not free from being suspected as being guilty. He's not free from the prying eyes or of somebody who suspects them of being a problem or a danger, right? He's not free from the ignorance, right? Because it's still present. It's still with us, right? And this is an idea that, once again, Frantz Fanon talks about in his existential phenomenology, this idea of what it means to be seen. What my friend was talking about, what Fanon is talking about, what, these leaders of this period are talking about, that what Malcolm X was talking about, he's that Black people are seen in a certain way. And that conscientiousness that he was talking about is that he is never going to be free because because he always feels that he's always going to be seen like this, regardless of how he sees himself. Right. And so this is that aspect of Black consciousness. And so the Black Panther Party ultimately, if take a look at the work of our federal government to break apart, to create conflict, to destroy this organization that was really about Black consciousness, building up Black communities, feeding and housing and giving health and hope to Black communities, how it was ultimately maligned and destroyed by an organization known as, well, a program known as COINTELPRO by the FBI. Take a look. It should be, I think it's on this link here. Yeah, right there. So please, take a look at that. Okay, but let's take a look at some of the other movements that happened during this period. Um, because when you talk about consciousness, when you talk about the awareness of the self, what was developing as a consequence of decolonization in Africa, what was developing as a consequence of Black Power movement and Black nationalism also begins to spread to other communities. And one of those is the Chicano movement. Take a look at some of the experiences that people of Mexican descent or or of Latin descent, what they had to deal with, right? I mean, we're talking about educational segregation. We're talking about violence and lynching. We're talking about the ability not to vote, right? Discrimination in public places, right? Sounds familiar, right? It's absolutely. And it's all because of language and culture, right? This is, depending on what part of the country you're in, that was the name of the game from California all the way through Texas. And so, what this does is that, what people take from the Chicano movement is that they were inspired by what they saw in the Black Power movement, what they saw in the Civil Rights movement, in very much the same way to try to assert their independence and rights and to fight for greater opportunities based off of the situations that they were facing. So whether that was, organizing, excuse me, from like Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez, which, by the way, there is some literature out there that has come to light in terms of the sexual abuse that Cesar Chavez exerted on people like Dolores Huerta, as well as other people in the United Farm Workers movement. Take a look at it. It is quite fascinating, but it's also, once again, it demonstrates the complications and the issues that exist within us as people. And no person is perfect. That there are people that are going to have problems, and this is not to have an excuse, to somehow be apologetic for Cesar Chavez. No, he he deserves whatever, he gets, although he's not with us anymore. Is it right that maybe they don't give him a holiday? That's that's fine. You could change the holiday. You don't have to call it Cesar Chavez Day. You could call it United Farm Workers Day. You could call it Dolores Huerta Day because I think the women, especially the Chicano movement, are often overlooked. So, take a look at that. The 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts are a great example of, what students were willing to do because it is very clear, especially during this movement, what students were facing in their schools. They couldn't speak Spanish. They were punished if they spoke Spanish, right? A language that they hear at home, that their parents speak and that they know. So they are bilingual students, but they couldn't speak it to their friends. The courses that they were required to take, they would often be put into courses, for air conditioning or mechanics, but not into chemistry or to, the higher math courses, right? Or business courses because of the color of their skin. I mean, heck, we could even go just as far as, if you want to look at the movie Stand and Deliver, which takes place in the 1980s, 20 years, after the 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts, you can see right there that there is still very much this discrimination and this disbelief that somehow people with Spanish surnames can achieve something, right? And we still see this today. We see that in the inequities and the mistreatment. We see it in the way that immigrants are, demonized, right? But, we have the same ICE agents who are picking people up simply because of their accent or their last name or the color of their skin, that they're still willing to go in and have, a taco and a quesadilla and some horchata. Completely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. If you are truly going to be somebody who is going to discriminate, then don't participate. It's that simple. If you're going to discriminate against immigrants, then don't participate with all the incredible contributions that immigrants make to this country. Okay, it's that simple. But take a look. Once again, there's some fascinating aspects here. There's this great documentary here that shows
The Chicano movement was a civil rights movement that mainly took place during the 60s, parallel to the other civil rights movements that were happening during the time.
right. Other civil rights movements that are happening during the time, the Chicano, but where are they located? They're located out west, right? Civil rights movements are happening, most of them are happening in the South, right? Especially those with Dr. King. You have the Black Power movements that are happening all throughout major cities throughout the United States. Malcolm X is located up in the North, right? Chicanos are located in areas of California throughout the Southwest, right? These are where their movements are. And so take a look at, this video because it's great. It has some issues that are very similar, talking about poverty, talking about job opportunities, education, very similar. Okay. Next, what we have the American Indian movement, right? Another one that takes place. This is much later. It does happen in the 60s, but it goes in until the 1970s. But I wanted to emphasize it because once again, it also reasserts itself in terms of identity, independence, self-defense, as well as taking on the several occupations that were taking place, whether that is at Wounded Knee or at Alcatraz. The key and core beliefs of the American Indian movement are, sovereignty and self-determination. Very similar to what you see from Malcolm X, very similar to what you see from the Black Power movement, very similar to what you see from the Black Panthers, right? This idea that they have their own sovereignty. Native Americans were sick and tired of being maligned. They are tired of every treaty being broken. They are tired of every promise and the continual, oppression and loss of their land, loss of their traditions, loss of their language, right? And this goes back all the way. Remember, I mean, the American Indian movement started as soon as Columbus landed. 1492. That's when it started because there has been constant resistance. But the one that is, that happens in the late 1960s and late 1970s is really bent on this idea of asserting a presence that's here in this country, right? They want determination. They want these treaties honored. They want to be able to have and advocate for themselves in these urban centers. They want to be a part of it. They're not uh, um, no longer are they satisfied with being located on reservations. And then absolutely they want to be able to preserve and revitalize their culture, especially their language and their traditions, because there is a constant assault on this, right? And I'll just use a perfect example. How many of you can point to something of a Native American contribution in American culture? You're probably thinking like, well, what the hell is a Native American contribution? Of course you wouldn't know any of that because why the hell would we cover that? But I mean, I'll just give it to you. 1/3 of all the food that is consumed on this earth was invented by Native Americans. Invented. Okay? Invented over periods of thousands of years. Did any of you eat anything made out of corn? Right? Did any of you eat peppers, tomatoes, right? Potatoes, right? Cranberries, chocolate, pumpkins, squash, right? Any of that. Any of that. That's all them. That's all them. So we need to be able to recognize the role, and that's what the American Indian movement was. It was about asserting that they're no longer going to just be these individuals that are just going to, it's fine. And you can see that they are armed. They literally take over Alcatraz and they take over Wounded Knee. They take it over, and you can hear these wonderful speeches by individuals by like Eddie Benton Benai and Clyde Bellencourt. These individuals are leaders of the movement. Fascinating topics, but listen to what they say. Listen to what they say and what they were trying to assert. And it's ultimately self-determination. They want to have this, they want an America, right? I think this is the best way to sum it up. What all of these, and actually, you know what? I'll do it at the end, because you guys need to know that. Okay, so finally, the last group that we're going to look at is the feminist movement, right? Now, there's two waves. The first wave we've already talked about. That was the one where women were trying to get the right to vote. Okay, so you have the Seneca Conference. The Seneca Falls Conference. You have the passage of the 19th Amendment, right? Women asserting the right to vote, right? And so that's what the first wave was dominated by, getting the right to vote. Pretty tangible, right? Well, from 1949 to the 1980s, the second wave period of feminism, is dominated in a different manner. We're looking at workplace equality, meaning like, are people getting paid the same amount of money for the same duties, the same job titles, right? We're talking about sex discrimination. We're talking about reproductive rights, whether that's, the ability for women to control their own bodies, whether that is access to an abortion, access to healthcare, access to the pill, right? And of course, access to education. So these are issues that the women's movement is fighting for at this time. Now, what's important to understand is that many of these women are still fighting on multiple fronts. So it's not just women in terms of, in terms of accessing equal pay. It's a Black woman that's trying to access equal pay, or a Chicano woman who's trying to access education, or right. So we have all of these areas in terms of these convergence of identities that are taking place during this period, that more and more people are starting to understand that there is actually a unique aspect to being a white female from the north as opposed to a Black female from the south, right? Where exactly do they converge on certain ideas and where do they diverge? How exactly do we make sure that people are able to come together on a certain movement, but to recognize the unique aspects of their own particular experiences? Okay, so take a look. When we think of these issues, oops, sorry, went too far. Went too far. There we go. Reproductive rights. I'm not going to get into too many of the details here because I'm going to leave this for another aspect of our discussion in terms of like one of the papers. But I will tell you this. Take a look at the history of contraception in terms of the pill, right? This was one of the first ways in which women could privately decide and have the opportunity to be able to control their choice to have a child, right? So this is the ability to control reproduction while allowing for sexual freedom, okay? And that is very crucial because prior to the access of the pill, women were just at, the mercy of having children, right? Having children, delaying this opportunity in which to access, employment or education or to do other things that they wanted to do. And so, of course, women would seek out, alternatives to this, whether these were going to be illegal abortions or going to other countries. But of course, that was expensive. The pill that was, first conceived of by people like Margaret Sanger, who was able to put together various teams. Margaret Sanger was a philanthropist, but she was able to put people like scientists like Gregory Pincus and John Rock, and Minwu Chang together to come up with a pill that could give women a private ability to regulate and control reproductivity, right? That they don't have to necessarily just say no, that I don't want to have sex, or for somebody to put on a condom. They can just decide for themselves that this gives them sexual freedom, the ability to choose when they want to have children. Revolutionary, right? But it wasn't just that. It was also the ability in which to, get rid of or terminate an abortion. Now we know that this right has no longer enshrined in terms of the Supreme Court. It is now left to the states, and depending on which state you live in, you may be able to access it. But accessing an abortion has often been tied to your class status, your finances. These are not cheap, and so now it's whether or not you can access it across state lines, or whether you can access it through the mail, right, through like a Plan B, or some other form of pregnancy termination. But this is all caught up in these, both the pill and the abortion fights, are caught up in, once again, self-determination. Self-determination for women to decide when they want to have children and how long and for how many, right? It is their choice. It is their choice. And so this is the reason why reproductive rights is so crucial for women, because women, in order for women to be able to exercise their access to those other things that men take for granted, whether it is jobs and education and everything else, women have the ability to keep being able to get access to that, but now they no longer have to fear having it being delayed, because they can access something that can prevent reproduction, right? Now, whether or not and how you may stand on that issue, it is just the simple fact of the choice that women have the ability to choose what they want to self-determine for themselves. And so when we think about that idea of self-determination and accessing those areas is, tied into this idea of workplace education, educational access, right? The acts that were passed in the 60s, whether it's the Equal Pay Act or the Civil Rights Act, or Title IX being signed in 1972, right? These are all aspects that were trying to build greater equality for women, right? Equality in the workplace, that they would get paid for the same work that they do. Like, we still know this today, that women are on average are making 80 cents per dollar, for every dollar that a man makes, right? And we have some great data that shows that how women are earning, depending on if you're a Black woman or a Latino woman or an Asian woman, how long it takes you to earn the same amount of salary as a man within a year. So for instance, for Black women, it would be like a year and a half compared to, a white man, right? That they would take them a year and a half to be able to equal the 1 year salary that a man would make, right? And so when you think about this, that women are performing these jobs and they don't get the same pay, think about how that goes back into the same discussions that we've had about how one's labor and earning from one's labor, the right to earn from one's labor, should be equal, right? This is how it gets into these issues here. And so take a look at these aspects in terms of like the Equal Rights Amendment, like this that was, never fully which never actually was ratified in our Constitution, right? And even the women that pushed against it, like Phyllis Schlafly, look at her. Why exactly would women be against this idea that, women should be, getting paid equally or have equal choice in terms of family reproduction or opportunities in terms of, education, right? Very similar parallels to the same women who didn't want women to get the right to vote. Okay, so take a look. But yes, if you have any questions or any comments or concerns, feel free to reach out.